So far, we've looked at a lot of different things that are in the CYFS domain. We looked at people, activities, ways to relate all those to each other. And the thing is, there's still a whole lot more. There's literally hundreds of different things in the CYFS domain and hundreds more in the rest of the NIEM. So how do we find out about those? I mean, we really can't go through them all in an introductory video like this. You've seen enough things just scrolling by the screen. Well, the way we do it is by providing guidebooks in the form of online tools. Online tools that let you explore the CYFS domain and the NIEM as a whole at your own pace, looking for whatever you want to look for. Now, there's a couple of main ones to talk about. The first is called Wayfarer, and Wayfarer is a tool that's been around for a long time for exploring these communities. You'll see the URL for it on the screen, but you'll also see a barcode which you can scan with something like a phone in case you don't want to type in the URL. It's just a shortcut for you because you can't really click on a video and go somewhere. The second one is called the SSGT, and I could tell you what it stands for, but then I'd have to tell you what all the words in it stand for, and then I'd have to tell you the concepts behind those words, and then it would be 3 days later. So for now, we'll just call it the SSGT, and it's another tool for exploring these communities, for exploring what's in the CYFS domain and what's in the NIEM as a whole. While these are the major two exploration tools, they're far from the only tools you can use to look at these communities and look at the elements inside them. There's a whole raft of tools available. Instead of listing them all, we're going to point you at a webinar. This webinar, hosted by the Department of Homeland Security, is simply an overview of the various tools that are available. Some that are for the NIEM as a whole, some that were developed specifically for the CYFS domain. So feel free to go and watch that webinar whenever it's convenient for you, but we would recommend you take a look at it. Finally, let's talk about some safety tips. Frankly, there are some gotchas in the NIEM, and that bleeds over into the CYFS domain. And sometimes you have to be careful that you're actually dealing with the right thing. A good example are loaded terms. Some terms have different meanings depending on the context. For example, if I'm talking to my doctor, and I say, "Doctor, I take a lot of drugs," I'm talking about medication. I'm talking about being concerned about the number of different medications I might be on and how they might interact. But instead, if I'm saying to, I don't know, perhaps a police officer, "Oh man, I take a lot of drugs," well, that's got an entirely different meaning. And so even a word like drug can have different meanings in different contexts. Hi folks, just a quick disclaimer here. I don't use illicit substances. In fact, the strongest thing I imbibe is a hot cup of tea. Now, my eyes were dilated in that photo simply because I had just returned from an eye exam. It's important to know that many ocular diseases can cause damage long before they cause noticeable symptoms. So it's important to see an ophthalmologist regularly. Remember, there's nothing jocular about diseases ocular. Now, one way CYFS deals with this is by using the term medication when we're talking about medication. Because frankly, the term drug in the NIEM is heavily loaded to be, well, the kind of drug you're not supposed to take. So we have a medication object. But it's good to be aware of those kind of loaded terms. Another one is disposition. If you just say a disposition, there's a certain legality attached to that in a lot of different contexts. And that's a legality that you may not want to have applied to a juvenile. That's why we have things like informal dispositions in the CYFS domain. So some terms are loaded. You just need to make sure that the term means the right thing in the context you're using it. Now, another gotcha that occurs in the NIEM, and of course bleeds over into CYFS, is surprise complexity. Objects that you think are very simple, and they turn out to be much more complex than you thought, and that can be an unpleasant surprise. A good example are dates. So we talked about activities earlier, and activities have a date. And we all know what a date is, right? Well, yes and no. I mean, you use the term activity date out of the NIEM, and that really has 6 different potential meanings in the NIEM. The date can be just the day of the month. You know, if we're talking April Fool's Day, it's 1. Or it could just be the month. Again, if we're talking April Fool's, we're talking about April. We're talking about 4. It might be a full date, April 4th, 2000 whatever. It might be a date combined with a time, sort of a date timestamp. So now it's April 1st, 2000 whatever at 12 noon. Could just be the year, 2000 or whatever, or it could be just the year and month. So the month of April in the year 2000 whatever. And you need to know which one you're talking about, because any of those 6 might be the one that's being used. And it actually gets more complex than this because there's also the concept of a date range. And the date range object has a start date and has an end date. And guess what? Each of those start and end dates can be any of those 6 different formats. So there's a lot more complexity there than you thought. You saw activity date and you went, oh, that's just a date. And it turns out it could be a lot of different things. And you just need to be mindful of that. Another area of surprise complexity is when the NIEM talks about identifications and IDs, because the NIEM thinks they're different things. In the NIEM, an identification is a full thing like a driver's license. It's not just the number. The number is the identification ID, and that's just a string. The identification itself is the whole boat. It's the state that issues it. It's all the information that's on it, including the picture. So in the NIEM, the concept of a piece of identification is really the whole ID with all that extra information. The identification ID, which is actually an abbreviation for identifier, is that string that we often think of when we think of a driver's license number. So keep that in mind. Driver's license identification is the whole card. The driver's license identification ID is the actual driver's license number. Are there other things that could be confusing in the NIEM and in CYFS? Yeah, of course there are. But these are kind of the main areas, the things that are going to trip you up the most. So if you're aware of them, you know them when you see them, and hopefully you won't have any troubles with them. So that about wraps it up for our quick tour of the CYFS domain. We've looked at the history of CYFS, we've looked at some of the major objects, and we've looked at the ways that things fit together, and we've had a few things to warn you about at the end. All that's left is to show you some resources for further exploration. Now also remember we talked about tools earlier, so those are resources as well. The first one to show you is the CYFS page. We have a page that's dedicated to the Children, Youth, and Family Services domain, and this is the kind of official home. Despite it being the official home, there's not a whole lot there, but there are links to the actual technical documents that underlie the domain. The second thing listed is the National Juvenile Information Sharing Initiative, and that's an incredibly important link, and actually probably the first place you should go to. That is the project that funds this video as well as several others. So if you're interested in information sharing within the realm of the juvenile community, that's really your first stop for any kind of information you might need. And then the last one there is NIEM Tools. This is just a really quick and dirty, ugly page that lists the various tools available for working with the NIEM and by inclusion also with the CYFS domain. Nothing pretty about it, it's just a laundry list of the different tools available. But it is a place to go to get a little more information about tools. And with that, thanks for your attention. Hope you've enjoyed your tour. Oh, good, he's gone.